This is Mainly Unspoken. Today our guest is Mark Finks, and he's going to be discussing judging policy. Welcome, Mark.
Well, thank you, Kelly. Glad to be here, as always.
Well, I'm delighted that you keep on coming back.
We're working our way through the Constitution a piece at a time.
Piece at a time.
Yeah.
So judging policy, what do you want to discuss about that?
The people who are keeping a scorecard here know that we have described a design for our federal government which is unique in all of history. The founders of the United States were wise enough to figure out that there were three basic functions that government performed. They would decide to make a policy. It starts at a particular time, and then governments also carry out the policy that's been made, and then there's a judicial function that judges policy in almost all cultures of the world. But the founders of the United States said every time two or more of those functions wind up in the same set of hands, some kind of tyrannical government results. So they said, we'll balance the powers, making them equal, and we'll separate them. We'll put them in separate branches of government so they have to interact with each other with a system of checks and balances. And that proved to be a very brilliant and wonderful innovation. That and a written constitution to restrain the actions of government officials made a huge difference in the United States. It's why we are what we are today, instead of being yet another completely totalitarian empire of which the world has seen many come and go.
So the separate branches were like watchdogs on each other, making sure they were doing their job right?
Yes, I think that can be fairly said. Perhaps a better way to look at it is that each branch would have some tendency to try to do its job the best it could, instead of just watching the other guys. The checks and balances interactions are the way that they watch each other, but on a day-to-day basis they spend most of their time and effort doing their job. Another part of the genius that the founding fathers had, they figured out a way to get human beings who were very fallible and full of all sorts of odd contradictions to at least do a pretty good basic job at running things.
So judging policy, we're going to be looking at the courts then?
Yes, the entire judicial branch of government, and we note with interest, especially in view of the current controversy down in Washington, that a key element of the checks and balances system in our government in the United States is that the executive gets to propose judges for the federal courts, and the Senate of the United States gets to review those nominations and either approve or disapprove them, and then the approval is ratified and the judge goes ahead and does his job the way he's supposed to. And what they're basically deciding, or supposed to be deciding, is whether this person is competent to judge the law that they have initiated and that the chief executive tries to administer. They're also supposed to use, at least the way the founders started our country out, the standard set by the Constitution of this country in terms of the functions of each branch and the protection of individual rights for every citizen. That's supposed to be the standard against which the law is judged. We've radically departed from that in recent years, but that's what they set up for us.
And how did that happen? How did we depart from that?
Well, perhaps the most prominent change, the one most worth talking about, is a particular philosophy for the judicial branch, which was cooked up by the likes of Felix Frankfurter and Roscoe Pound at the Harvard Law School back in the 19-teens.
Oh, wow.
And what they said was, instead of judging the compliance of a particular law or administrative action against the standard of the Constitution, that they would use a different means. They would use human behavior and human beliefs as the standard. So obviously, if you have humans whose behavior is changing, you wind up with a changing standard, like a floating crap game or a moving target. It's pretty hard to hit. And they call this stuff by various names, but the $10 word for it is sociological jurisprudence. In other words, we're going to use society and man's behavior as the measure of the law.
But wait a minute, I thought we had rule of law was by the written Constitution. So if the Constitution says this is how it is, people can't change that.
That's how it had been up until the time they started cooking up this idea, and the Harvard Law School thought that was great. And
But isn't that totally unconstitutional? How can they do that? I mean,
the strict constructionists would say yes, and when there was the great controversy over Robert Bork's nomination to the Supreme Court, that's exactly what the dispute was about, where Bork was much more interested in the intent of the framers of the Constitution than he was in all this other.
and when was Bork put in office? Or,
Well, he never was. He was savagely attacked quite a few years ago now. What has it been, 20 or nearly that amount? But that
20
whole,
or 30 years, okay.
it's been since the 1980s.
So about a little over 20 years ago.
Yeah, and Bork was viciously attacked as some sort of stuffy ideologue who went too far back in our history and didn't buy this idea that man's behavior was the standard. But a lot of the frustration that modern Americans feel about the judicial system, which includes the lower courts and includes attorneys and various other things, has to do with the fact that instead of having a standard approach to government, which was a brilliant innovation on the part of the founders of this country, every tradesman, every farmer, every citizen of this country could easily understand what was supposed to be happening. They had all of these tricky examinations of behavior and society's opinions about things, which of course were not law. They were just things that were measurements of people's attitudes. I guess that's the kindest way we can put it. And of course,
So we're not living under the Constitution anymore.
not the way it was designed, no. There's no question about that. And part of the reason that we're even doing this series is to give people some food for thought. Because what I always encounter, I've done this over 20 years, I've taught people about the Constitution of the United States, and the typical thing that happens once they realize what's going on is they say, well, wait a minute. I love what the founders of this country set out to do. It's brilliant. It worked. And by any objective measure, you compare it to the other nations of this world, it gave the most stability and the most prosperity and the most innovation and all kinds of other things. And then we turn right around and go back into the darkness of emperors and kings and other people who wanted people's opinions to govern instead of ruled by law, and that's essentially what sociological jurisprudence is. It's the use of opinions to govern society, not the principles of law.
But do they teach that in school, or do they still teach in school that we go by the Constitution?
Well,
Or the standard of
once
the
the Harvard Law School started, it spread like a virus throughout all the law schools of the country, and now you'd be hard-pressed to find a lawyer or a judge who wouldn't kowtow to this modern idea of letting man's society's behavior set the averages or norms for what is considered acceptable in society.
And of course that changes with the wind. Every generation there's a new standard. Every time somebody new comes into
and
power.
gets worse and worse. If you have society in a type of cultural death spiral, which is what we have in the United States today, with the poor young people just bewildered and living a lot of things that I think would be correctly considered crazy 20 or 30 years ago.
And when you say death spiral, what do you mean by that?
Well, it means that society is getting more chaotic. The families are less able to get married and stay married. They're less able to raise children in a stable environment with principles of right and wrong, to develop some kind of important sense of right and wrong so that their own internal clock and their own internal discipline works. They have a sense of what's appropriate at certain times in their lives.
And essentially, too, when we moved away from the rule of law, which is, I guess, what happened when the Harvard professors decided they were going to go by
That's right.
or attitude instead of rule of law, that's when the people started losing power, and the government started to control the people more.
Yeah, you could regard it as a type of vacuum. And nature hates vacuums. It always fills them. So if people are told that we're going to have a behavioral standard in the law instead of a legal standard, which is what the Great Divide is all about there, they begin to lose faith in the system. And we've seen a lot of decisions in the last 30 years that really speak loudly about that.
Can you name some of those decisions?
Roe versus Wade and Roe versus Bolton are a couple of the great ones, dealing with a so-called right to privacy and the penumbra, the shadow around the Constitution. Out there somewhere in the right to privacy, they find this right to decide what to do with your own body, supposedly, but we know that a child in the womb is actually a separate person with separate genetics, and if it's able to survive outside the womb is an entirely separate identity. And what we've done is kill in excess of 40 million of these little people because we've decided that we're going to use a behavioral standard for the law instead of the simple principle that you won't do anything to harm a child in the womb, which is hundreds and hundreds of years old, is a Judeo-Christian principle and embodied in the Hippocratic Oath that doctors all take or took until recent years.
Okay, so are you saying that within the Constitution, it would be illegal or against the rule of law to have an abortion?
Well, if you start from the organic law of the United States, which includes the Magna Carta and the Declaration of Independence, the Declaration says we hold these rights to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights that cannot be taken away, that among these are life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. Now, if the Creator, God Himself, endows us with life, then that's it. God gives life, and humans don't have the authority to take it away. They just flat don't. And in the Ten Commandments, it doesn't say thou shalt not kill. There's a better rendering of the ancient language to say thou shalt not murder. In other words, you won't kill with malice aforethought. You won't intentionally kill. You can kill in self-defense because your own life would be forfeit if you didn't. That's a very well-established principle in both the Old and New Testament. But the idea that you would deliberately extinguish a life
But
is
if a woman's
forbidden.
health was in danger because of the pregnancy, then that would
If
be
she was
something.
if she was about to die and could live another day to have other children or whatever other situation might be involved, there's an obvious possibility there you're making a type of life and death decision which is therapeutic. You're attempting to save the mother and even at the loss of the child, if it's one of those situations. And we know of a number of we have experience within our own families and friends of people who died in childbirth and had a child survive, and it's one of those heroic and difficult things that physicians are faced with at times in their career, and they have to do the best they can right then. That is not a denial of the principle. It's an effort to preserve the life, usually of both. They try to save both the child and the mother and do the best they can. That would not be intentionally killing by any means. But the way a modern abortion clinic is run, there's no question that it's intentional. That's the purpose. That's why it's there. That's why people go there. They intend to destroy the child.
So you think that that's one way that society is spiraling down because of a loss of morals?
Not only that, but as has been correctly predicted in Patrick Buchanan's book, Death of the West, he refers to the fact that Pope Paul back in 1968 made certain statements about the likely result of birth control pills and the whole culture that surrounded that, the contraception and family planning philosophy. And what he correctly predicted was that it was going to cheapen or devalue life, lead to greatly increased marital infidelity and the disruption of families and the devaluing of children and their happiness and upbringing. It's very ironic that the people who are in favor of all these things that violate ancient principles of law always do it in the name of children and their well-being. when really, if you look at the last 30 or 40 years in our society, you see people going precipitously downhill. The families, the individuals, the young kids coming up bewildered with no sense of right or wrong or values. And we're in serious trouble, exactly as was predicted in 1968. You could see it coming. So
By Pat Buchanan.
no, well, Buchanan just cites what Pope Paul said in 1968. But a lot of others said it. The founders of this nation, in effect, said, if you're wise enough to keep powers balanced and separated and have a standard for right and wrong, which is embodied in a written constitution, then perhaps you can keep your government. You can have a stable government. If you don't heed our advice and let this slip away from you, then you'll have something unstable and it will eventually collapse. That's the lesson that history teaches.
And it's just, but what else has changed then? How else have we gotten away from the standard of the Constitution besides the abortion issue? Are there other areas that we've gotten away from the Constitution?
Well, tons of them. Any area in which you let human behavior tell you what ought to happen in society. Let's take, for lack of a better example, it's a pretty good example, the Enron scandal, where you had an accounting firm shredding documents like crazy. They're under indictment for obstructing justice and various other things. And then you had a company playing fast and loose with their balance statements, hiding their debt and keeping their stock artificially high in the marketplace, and they're just flat lying, cheating, and stealing is really what they were doing. So where the founders of the United States believed what the Ten Commandments said, the statements that thou shalt not steal, for example, or bear false witness, you won't tell lies, those were the standards that the justices used because they were embodied in the principles of the Constitution, that there was a right and wrong, a knowable right and wrong, and that people could live by that standard, which wouldn't change.
So let's go back down to the 19-teens with these Harvard professors decided they weren't going to go really by the rule of law, but this...
No, they were actually going to architect or shape society by using a whole bunch of courtroom procedures and creating case law precedent that kept shifting society toward its current behavior patterns.
But why do you think why did they break away from the Constitution to begin with? Were they trying to control society? Were they trying to get more power?
Trying to reshape it in the image that they wanted for it. They were basically leftist philosophers politically, and they intended to use the judiciary as a means to accomplish social change.
And they did a good job.
Unfortunately for us, yes. They've changed things that we would say have been changed destructively.
Okay, so right now everyone is believing in this social change because the courts go by case law. They don't necessarily.
Well, yeah, they think that change is part of life, and they talk about the flexibility of the Constitution as a flexible document, a living document. You hear all these things, but what it's really doing is shifting the whole judicial branch of the government in this crazy direction. The crazier society gets, the crazier the case law decisions get. That's a good way to look at it.
Because they don't have a standard.
Yeah, no standard for truth.
What did, again, you probably already answered this question, but when the founders envisioned the court system, how did they expect them to judge the Constitution or to judge the court cases?
What they expected them to do, which they set out to do initially, Chief Justice John Marshall and the others way back at the beginning, was to judge compliance of a particular policy against the standard of the Constitution. And they didn't speak spontaneously. They didn't just speak up when they decided to speak. They spoke only when someone brought a case to them asking them a specific question which they could deal with in the judicial branch. They didn't volunteer anything. They waited until they were spoken to, and then when they agreed to take the case, they would try to make a definitive statement about the issue.
Why is it the Constitution was written so plainly, though, in pretty plain English?
Very, very plain. Yeah.
So what was in the founders' head that we would need a judiciary system to interpret the Constitution if it was written so plainly for
Well,
everyone?
well, you always have questions, and there's tons of, just to try to decide if a particular situation passes muster or not, you've got to have somebody give an opinion, and better that it should be done in a separate branch of government than done in either the executive branch or the legislative branch.
But right now, we don't have an honest court system. Would you say that, or am I?
Well, let's just say we have made the courts subject to some of the darker aspects of human nature. And the founders knew that that would be true, but by keeping the powers balanced and separated, we didn't want the judiciary legislating with its court decisions, of writing all this new policy and a numerous...
But that's what they're doing.
Exactly what they're doing. That's right.
They're legislators as well as judiciary people.
They are...
They make law.
Improperly making law. And just to pick a current example, which will be in the press probably at the time this is viewed by many people, our current senior senator, Olympia Snow, is raising a considerable ruckus about controlling fisheries and agriculture through court decisions. She's focused on the fishery aspect right now. We've got some environmental activists who've complained in the courts about the fish stock and the various things pertaining to the environment. Then you have the courts giving these decisions that impact directly on the active fishing fleet, much to their horror, I guess. And Snow's point is that if things are that seriously out of whack, you go to the Congress and you have some type of investigation, you generate some policy, and you put it through the system from the front end. You don't bring it into the courts, bring it out in judicial decisions by continually throwing lawsuits. You go over to the Congress and get some laws passed that will address the situation. That's what she has just said within the last few days.
But that's the appropriate thing to do.
That would be the appropriate thing to do. She's right about that. One of the rare times I agree with her, but that's true. It should be done. The policy should be initiated in the Congress and then carried out by the executive. And then if problems arise with that policy, then the courts could be asked to step in.
But of all people, the courts, the judges, they must understand the Constitution, and they must understand that we're supposed to have 3 different branches, and they must understand that they're making law.
Well,
and they must understand that's wrong and unconstitutional.
Remember that when you and all the lawyers and judges you know have been raised in the same mother's milk there with all this doctrine's been around a lot of years, over 80 years, it's pretty hard to persuade them otherwise. We have a fellow from Maine who is the first president of the American Bar Association from Maine in over 90 years. And he and I used to be debate partners at Portland High School way back when. He was a class behind me, and I knew him well as a young man. I don't know him well as an adult, but he's been spending the past year as president of the American Bar Association going around giving all these speeches and making various kinds of public statements, going over to Europe to help them set up a legal system in the devastated Slovakian countries there and all this. And I can see, not having seen him or talked with him for these many years, that he is substantially influenced by this philosophy. There's no question. It's in a lot of his public statements. So one thing I would enjoy doing sometime is just sitting down with him and having a conversation like the one we're having now, saying, well, so what do you think of sociological jurisprudence? Should man's behavior be the standard, or should the unchanging principles of truth and justice be the standard?
Or he lives here in Maine?
Oh, yes. Yeah,
Yes,
he's
Portland.
He's a Portland lawyer, yeah.
Well, give me his name, and I'll give him a call, and next time you come on, maybe I can get him on.
Well, you never know.
Oh, you give him a call, see if he'll come on.
It's worth making the request. You can ask him what he thinks of things like political correctness, so you're trying to literally pluck words out of people's mouths before they utter them. Oh, you can't say that. That's not correct. Which is as far away from what the founders intended as you could possibly get. But it's an example of the way the system
is controlling people.
It's headed in that direction and has been for many, many decades. So it's pretty hard to change direction once you've done that. And that's the...
So you're saying it's a lost cause that will never live under the rule of the Constitution again?
No, I'm saying that that Americans need to repent of their wrongdoing. They need to decide that they've headed down the wrong road with all this stuff, and they want to respect what the founders set up for them instead and have a system that runs that way.
And they start that by dealing with their local government, right?
Yeah, well, and you also have to deal with yourself. You have to decide that the apathetic and uncaring attitude, which is what most Americans have wound up doing, is wrong. That you really have to take an active interest if you really expect to see anything change. And you have every discouragement, every inducement not to get active. So people need to get very well grounded in what the founders wanted for this country, and then decide that they like that a lot,
So
enough to work for it.
So you say they're induced not to take an active role in government?
Well, people feel kind of passive. They feel as though whatever they did would be unavailing, ineffective.
And they have that attitude because they're taught that attitude.
Yeah, the schools basically teach people to emote and to relate. The government schools are not taught to read, write, count, and think as they formerly were taught. And the whole focus in the United States for a long, long time, well over 150 years, was on individual responsibility, individual conscience, and initiative, which is completely consistent with the design of government that the founders had. You have to be, in a very profound way, a self-governing person with a sense of right and wrong and discipline and character in order for the design of government that the founders developed to be really effective. And in fact, Washington and the others said, well, without the ability to govern yourself, and they specifically refer to America's Judeo-Christian roots, that we would be ungovernable by the Constitution, because people would simply not obey God or obey themselves in terms of what is right and wrong, and you'd wind up with a society that was terribly corrupt. Sounds familiar, doesn't it?
How would you describe the Maine judicial system today?
In the state of Maine?
Yeah.
Oh, it's followed the national trend without any question. And you hear a lot of interesting discussions from the Chief Justices of the Maine Supreme Court and other people who give opinions. And you can see the extraordinary degree to which they see the judiciary as architecting or shaping society. They've bought this whole idea, hook, line, and sinker. And if people were really thinking about that one, they would be a little alarmed, more than a little alarmed.
And the legislators aren't upset about this?
Well, you have to know that there's something wrong before you're going to get upset. They have no pain.
They just accept it. That's how it is.
Well, they came and found it.
Yeah.
This is how it was when I got here. So this must be what to expect. That's about as far as many of them think. Not all, but many.
But it must be very confusing for kids to read the Constitution and to see how life really works, because they're totally contradictory.
Well,
and we only have 2 minutes left, so you have 2 minutes to answer that.
Yeah. Actually, if you think about it, I've kind of watched the model legislature and various other things that high school students have been involved with over the years. And it's very interesting how the kids have some smattering, some slight familiarity with the design of government, but then the hands-on exercises, they go up to the State House and sit in the legislators' seats and have a mock legislature like Boys State and all this stuff, is that this is kind of this is the nitty-gritty inside stuff where we're dealing with practical problems of society. So they learn to be double-minded and equivocal even from the time they're kids. And yet the wrong guys running invariably the people running those workshops are generally the liberal manipulators who hang around and lend time to those programs. They're not getting the constitutional view or what conservatives would want them to hear. So that's all very fascinating. It's been that way for quite a while.
20 seconds left. What is the one thing you want everyone to remember about this show?
That the judiciary really was designed to do what common sense would tell you it should, to decide in a particular situation, knowing right and wrong, what is right and what is wrong. That's really what we want them to do, not this modern stuff.
Okay. Thank you, Mark.
My pleasure.
Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.